Hello, everyone. We are just waiting for a couple more people to get on the call. The number is going up very quickly. Thank you all for joining us today. So we'll get started. We'll be filming today, so if anyone is interested in sharing this with your staff or partners that you are in touch with, you will get a link to it after the presentation today. My name is Amity. I'm the Director of Communications for Color of Change. So excited to be able to introduce you all to Rashad Robinson, Color of Change's president, and we will be presenting today on telling the right story on race during COVID-19. Color of Change, we understand that policy fights are just one level of the work, that culture and changing narrative is really important. And with that, I will pass it over to Rashad Robinson, again, Color of Change's president, to present to you all today.
Great. Well, thanks, Amity. And it is good to be with you all virtually. I am looking forward to a time where we can be in and share more physical space together. But what I'm going to do today is walk us through some work that we've been doing at Color of Change. So I'm going to jump right in because I really want to get to the discussion as well. And I'm going to share my screen so we can walk through this presentation. All right, we are shared. And so we're going to take some time for a lot of discussion, but I want to start off with a couple of thoughts. The conversation about race and racism is happening bigger and faster in more places than it has for most of us in our lifetime. And we are seeing a lot of powerful symbols challenged right now and even changed. And we are also seeing people look even deeper than that into the rules and the systems that continually reproduce racism and the rhetoric and thinking that props up those systems. Can we keep changing the way people think and force them and ourselves to let go of racist thinking? That's what this session is all about. In addition to building power to force changes in policy, we are going to build the power it takes to change thinking and ultimately change norms. And what does the way we talk about COVID have to do with that? We need to do a lot of work to end racism in our healthcare system, but at least now on the table is a new conversation. And so I want to start right here with this chart, because even before George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis by the police, we saw news media taking a lot of care to report on what they call racial disparities with good intentions. They were largely, in most cases, I think, trying to help, trying to share information, yet they don't see how those words, disparity, are just another way of reinforcing what it feels like to some as some sort of external or natural difference between Black people and everyone else. When they focus on the outcomes and not the causes, that's the idea that it can reinforce, that Black people are different. Because the fact of the matter is that facts don't matter as much as the truth. I said this in the paper, which you can get at colorofchange.org/narrative power, and we'll make sure we send it around afterwards. But I said it in the paper that we wrote, that facts don't matter as much as the truth. What is the truth we are telling when we tell a story, when we present a set of facts, or use our favorite language? Is it the story? Does the story do any lifting of new narratives? Does it point people towards the right thing? There is no reason why the news media couldn't use different charts. Instead of a chart on the death disparities, or highlighting the differences in the death disparities, they could have used a chart that highlighted the differences in investment in Black health compared to others, or highlighting the laws and the people that allow that to happen, or the lack of prosecution of racial abuses, or the over-prosecution of our lives. There could have been all choices that were made, but far too often we see a focus on disparities, which ends up being a focus on the outcomes, not a focus on the inputs, and makes it so that there is something sort of inherently flawed about Black people, something sort of undeserving of investment. We could show the differences in predatory marketing of cigarettes, of junk food to Black kids, all sorts of ways in which Stories and data could help to elevate why we are in these challenges, but far too often we spend our time with data that tells us the outcomes of our underinvestment, not shows us all of the choices we have made as a society that have got us into this problem. So this is a quarantine in which Black people were arrested and beaten for not wearing masks, while white people who were not wearing masks were offered masks for free by police. Police who see themselves as actually existing to serve them and not control them. We may hear about both stories, but do we see them up against one another, next to one another like this, in a way that we see those bar graphs about COVID deaths? Do we talk about the policies that lead to the disparities? If we don't, we can't assume that people will just draw the right conclusion for themselves, let alone take action, which is actually the driver for how we move anything forward. Now, these are COVID charts, but I could have easily put up charts about the relationship of the news stories in 2005 during Katrina, where white people who were searching for food were talked about as searching for food and searching for resources, and Black people were talked about as looters. We could sort of talk about sort of the impact of the 2008 financial crisis and the sort of ways in which the banks presented predatory practices on Black and brown communities and on poor white communities, and look at the differences and how those stories were told and who was shown as deserving of understanding and empathy and who was not. Time and time again, sort of these stories up against each other are part of how we have to work to disrupt. It can't simply be about getting out the data and believing that information alone is power. So when it comes to, white people and Black people, if we continue to talk about the same behaviors differently, we will continue to treat the same behaviors differently. In criminal justice, in healthcare, in parenting, when it comes to wearing a mask everywhere, all of these places where the same behaviors exhibited by white people are explained completely differently and with so much more compassion and understanding than when it's Black people showing those behaviors. And we can reinforce that. This seems so obvious, right? It seems so obvious, but we actually don't practice this over and over again. Even among progressive organizations and across philanthropy, we still far too often reinforce the idea of racial difference rather than challenging it. We are reinforcing that Black people are inferior and in so much of what we say, and that we have to break that pattern day in and day out. And that applies to all behaviors, even the behaviors of dying from COVID-19. We talk about it differently for different people. And so it tells a different story about those people, which suggests we should treat it differently for certain people, which leads to more differences in who dies and who doesn't. When we talk about Black people dying from COVID-19, when we talk about the most vulnerable, we are often reinforcing the perception of Black people as weak, rather than the racism of the system being so strong. Vulnerability is a personal trait. We can all be vulnerable because of things that we see or things that happen to us individually, and that may be, we might need to talk to our therapist or a friend or whatever. But communities like Black communities are not vulnerable. We have been targeted. We have been under attack. We have been exploited. When we talk about Black communities as vulnerable, we spend our time trying to fix Black people and Black families rather than fixing the systems and the structures that have targeted and hurt us. We focus the energy and the passion on what do we do to fix those people rather than how do we undo the systems and the structures which have put people in harm's way. It gets down, though, to the stories, right? The stories that we tell. Different stories lead to different behaviors. And it's so connected. We can't just point to problems. We have to frame those problems in a way that leads to the solutions we actually want. Once again, we can't expect people to simply draw their own conclusions when they see data or hear stories of disparities. And that sort of story of unfortunate almost that inequality is a car accident. It sort of just happened, creates a pity narrative around race, and is a narrative of resignation. It doesn't lead to restructuring society or rewriting rules that shape society. It leads to rationalizing the system we have. Some people will feel guilty, and some people don't. But overall, we do not get to a critical mass of people dedicated and ready to do anything about it, to equalize privilege. Media still largely talks about racism in this charity mindset. It's pity. It can actually take us away from where we need to go. Essentially, they are still talking about Black people largely in terms of inferiority. Inferior, undeserving, makers of our own mess. And the big one, unworthy of power, especially not worthy of economic investment, which must be reserved for white people who have somehow earned it and deserved it. When we tell these stories of unfortunate rather than stories of unjust, we get charitable solutions to structural problems, water bottles to Flint and stopping there instead of cleaning up the pipes, which would mean changes in how we execute on tax policy, changes in how we structure, how we fund, changes to how corporations pay their fair share. We will do service days at inner city schools and believe that the mentorship program is enough without interrogating why some schools have the things that they need and other schools don't, and how the choices, the economic choices our society has made has led there. So talking about race is important, but the way we talk about race is even more important. And that's what the paper is all about. And that's what this body of work that I have been working to drive over the last several years at Color of Change, this narrative work of recognizing that narrative is about power. Narrative is about building power around ideas that can move people in motion and change the rules, both written and unwritten rules that govern our lives. In the case of healthcare and COVID, what is the real disparity that we need to talk about? What is the difference between talking about outcomes and talking about causes? And not just generalized causes, poverty, but specific causes like decisions about investment. The difference is huge, and the difference between losing or winning real change. You know, there's a big question in front of us right now, which is, I know many of us are thinking about. And it's part of why I wrote the paper and about why we're talking about race during COVID. There's so much more at stake in getting this right. So after the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act passed, Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, and others knew there would be backlash against civil rights, but also that even deeper economic systems and structures had to be changed if there was going to be real justice and real freedom. With John Lewis's passing, I feel like we're even more connected right now to that history and that time. And so I wanted to elevate a couple of pieces, a couple of quotes from King that I think really speaks to the transition from the sort of policy and structural change of civil rights to the poor people's movement and many of the work to like really deal with the sort of economic underpinnings. King said, "We aren't merely struggling to integrate a lunch counter now. We are struggling to get some money to be able to buy a hamburger or a steak when we get to that counter." In Mississippi, sort of in the lead up to more of the work around the poor people's movement, he said, it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. And so the stories, the conversation, saying what we believe is so critical to moving in that direction. And so what is the story? And so I want to get to that and spend a little time here because COVID, the conversations around COVID are not just about health, right? It's about the economy and about the economic decisions that we have made that play themselves out across all the ways in which we get to live. People do not experience issues we experience life, that the forces that hold us back are deeply interrelated, that a racist criminal justice system requires a racist media culture to create the demand to keep it alive, that economic inequality goes hand in hand with political inequality, and how we talk about those issues is incredibly important. So far too often, we talk about the systems that impact Black people and Black people's lives in passive voice, and we talk about Black people in active voice. And so we will say Black businesses are failing to get loans, where Black people are the active sort of player in this space, rather than banks are cheating Black people out of loans. And we are sort of saying not what we actually believe, I believe, as progressives. We are saying in the first version that it's well-meaning. It's easy to fall into, but it's dangerous. And you can see by seeing the second how different it is to see what's on the right. But once we've said what's on the left, you can't unsee it. It is sort of there in our mental model, and over again, it speaks to this thing of what's wrong with Black people. And we do this across all groups. I will hear folks say women are less likely to get jobs in the C-suite of tech companies, rather than tech companies exclude women from the C-suite. On one hand, we will get people talking about a lot of mentorship programs and pipeline programs to help people do better inside of structures and systemic structures that have hurt them. In this example around the banks, we will spend a lot of time saying, oh, if Black people just had more financial literacy programs, these banks, which from their very founding have exploited, targeted, and cheated Black people out of wealth, resource, and opportunity, will somehow magically be better if Black people just learned how to manage the system. This is the problem with how race is talked about day in and day. Is if Black people just learned how to play the game better, we would win, not that the game fundamentally needs to change. If my grandfather could just read better, the test at the polling place, the literacy test, wouldn't have been targeted towards him. We can't actually believe that, and we have to recognize and focus our energy on actually changing the rules. You know, the deeper and deeper idea under all of this, the under sort of lying piece of all of this paper, is that Black people are always the problem in society, never the solution, always the problem, always dragging everyone else down. And even when we hear things like white people repeat, trust Black women, is that really the belief deep down? Or is it just signaling? Is it better than nothing? But is it not good enough to support changing the power structures in America? So it's not easy to change practice. In fact, it's incredibly hard to change practices. Some of the things that we're doing, we can't simply undo overnight. We say vulnerable communities because social service language has seeped in and become dominant inside of the ways in which we talk about race and how we talk about so many. That charitable frameworks are helpful and useful to a capitalist society because it means that we can talk about charity without having to undo structures and systems that will continue to sort of replicate themselves. We can continue to see inequality expand and not have to change rules, but make ourselves feel like we are helping. So it's not easy to change practice, but we have to do it. We can't just focus on Black pain. It can be motivating, but it's often still just projecting an idea of deficit. We have to also lean into Black joy, Black brilliance, Black creativity, all of the contributions and the ways in which Black people have contributed and made this country great. If we start changing those things, then it's much easier to focusing on the systems that have hurt people, because you're not starting out with people as the deficit, but you're recognizing that if people are not succeeding in the system, it's not simply them, but we actually have to interrogate the system. And so, yes, we need to focus on systems instead of individuals. And some of these shifts in practice we hear a lot, like hearing people say we need to focus on systems and not individuals, systems, not individuals, or we hear that over and over again. But I also want to dig into something else, and something that our opponents on the right do, I think, really well. The right wing definitely has a systems view of poverty as well. And sometimes we may think that they're just talking about individuals, but it's just a different system. They think that there is a terrible system at work as well when it comes to poverty, and it's called Black culture. Yes, it's not an individual's fault, it's the system they live in, inferior Black culture. That's a system too. So there's nothing inherently about talking about system approach or an individual approach, and that is why the story and where we lean in is going to be so important. We hear about Black on Black crime, absentee Black fathers, inadequate Black mothers, Black music, everything. The assumption about Black culture runs very, very deep. And it's all over the reporting about COVID, and even how we talk about it in our own movements. So the answer is moving Black people into the protagonist position. Who built this country? Who are leading in the healthcare and essential worker spaces? Who are pushing America to its ideals and fighting for freedoms that everyone benefits? It's even in some of the knee-jerk reactions we do on the left. I've heard so many people tell young Black protesters, make sure you vote, like you should vote, or the way to solve this is voting, as if Black people are not the protagonists in the American story of voting, that no group of people have fought harder, faced more indignities, stood on longer lines in order to be able to express their will for a better future, that have overcome all sorts of barriers day in and day out in their quest to be able to participate in our democracy, when there were so many times and so many messages day in and day out that could have told people that it didn't matter at all, but still believing that it was possible and that they should participate. Black people have been the protagonists in the American story of education, have faced underfunding, exploitation from the very beginning of our sort of experience in this country, facing the threat of death simply for learning how to read. Retelling the stories about Black people's relationship to these systems will allow us to focus on the sort of right set of solutions. So it's not simply sort of talking about a systems approach, but it's about how we place Black people in that story as not simply deserving of charity, but of deserving of the type of system change that unlocks the potential and the opportunity. And so I wanna just end by saying that I feel like I'm missing a final slide here, but I want to focus on the final thing I just want to say is that there's a couple of places that you can get these papers, right, on colorofchange.org. They've been published a number of other places, but through the Q&A section, I'll try to pull up that final slide, but all to say that across many different places, we are sort of working to move from unfortunate to unjust, to recognize that we can't just talk about systems in passive voice, but we have to talk about those systems in active voice, that we have to focus on changing the rules, that we have to recognize that Black communities are not vulnerable, but Black communities have been under attack. Black communities have been targeted. Black communities have been exploited. Those are some of the many things that we have to really focus on if we are going to unlock what I believe is the sort of true potential to use and leverage this story and leverage this moment for the type of generational change, the type of seismic change that is possible. So just to recap in sort of telling the right story on race, saying what we believe and not what we don't, balance the stories we tell and the associations we promote. Black people are not vulnerable, we are under attack. Black people are not dying, we are being killed. It's not a passive experience here. Black people don't need help, we need justice. Advocate for justice, not merely charity. And rally around real solutions, not just problems. I want to end here, and I want to say what I think is sort of really important for all of us to remember in this moment. Is that as I think about the seismic shifts that happened during the 60s, I think about the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, I think about all the sort of big policy changes that were made, that the right has built tons of infrastructure to attack. They have attacked that infrastructure in powerful ways, but it took decades. to undo aspects of the Voting Rights Act, to use the courts to undo aspects of the gains that we've made in civil rights, for technology and social media platforms who are trying to pull us into the future technology-wise, dragging us into the past through how the ways that their algorithms bypass civil rights law, like ads that can discriminate because they're only marketed towards white people or to men. All of those things were about the written rules. I believe this moment is about the unwritten rules. And that is also going to require a different type of infrastructure, a media and narrative infrastructure, the ability to produce and create content, the ability to, at scale, tell the right story, the ability from a narrative infrastructure space to be able to drive stories and conversations at scale, to reach beyond the choir of our own movements, to say what we mean and to drive people to act in powerful ways. All of that will help us determine whether or not we change the written rules and the unwritten rules at a scale that I think is necessary to really make good on what I believe is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for seismic cultural and political change. So I will stop there and we'll open it up for questions.
Great, thank you, Rashad. The first question that we have that came in is around other communities of color. So the question is how, obviously, Color of Change focuses in on Black communities. How do you see this report and information relating to other communities of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think anti-Blackness is a kind of operating system for how race is viewed in America and viewed globally in many ways. And I think in the sort of expansion of whiteness over generations, we watch as communities are sort of treated either like or close to Black people, and then sort of experiencing sort of the impacts of that across many systems. And so, yeah, we are unapologetically a Black organization, and we speak, and we represent, and we engage Black folks. And so that's where we wrote this paper from, and I think that's important. But we are in all sorts of conversations every day with allies across other communities, and think that there is so much to draw from. The final thing I say is that we say this a lot at Color of Change, is that when Black people win, everyone wins. The history of this country, the history of the written rule changes that have happened as a result of Black movements have benefited so many other communities and have created so many other openings. And if we can tell the right story to undo anti-Blackness, not just sort of across this country, but within Black communities and within other racial communities, the opportunities for the type of seismic shifts and seismic openings are really clear. And so for me, this does relate, but I think in narrative and messaging work, you also have to, once again, say what you mean and be specific. And so I also want to say is I think that sometimes we say people of color when we mean Black, or we say people of color when we mean Indigenous folks, or we say people of color when we mean API immigrants. And I think we need to say what we mean as well, because there are really specific nuances and specific experiences that relate to various communities that aren't a catch-all for everyone who isn't white. And that we want to make sure that we're also being responsive to that.
Great. I think you answered the next question that came in. I'll remind everyone that's listening in that if you have a question, you can submit it either via chat or via the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen. And I will also mention that, Color of Change, we always take in information from our community. And so we will be updating the narrative document with some of the questions to reflect some of the questions that are coming up during this presentation. So the next question comes in from Jane Lee, and it is, what questions can we ask ourselves to figure out what the real solutions are when we tell stories?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of questions I will ask myself is I will first try to get to the root of what the problem actually is. Like, if we're talking about education, if we're talking about healthcare, what is the problem and why do we have the problem? And I do think that lots of times the ways in which hyper-capitalism, the ways in which white supremacy, the ways in which a lot of systems that have hurt Black people rely on us to focus on individuals rather than systems. Because if we focus on individuals, then we can always have sort of anecdotal stories, whatabouts. We can always have the things that sort of stop us from actually making changes to the environments and the factors that have hurt people. And so the questions that we oftentimes have to ask ourselves and interrogate are, what are the systems and the structures that are putting us in harm's way? And then we have to ask ourselves about the barriers to making change, right? Because I do think that we can sometimes fetishize hearts and minds work. And I say that as a person who has led some of the most important hearts and minds campaigns, particularly in the LGBT rights space and now in the racial justice space. I am not downgrading hearts and minds, but I think if you talk about hearts and minds without recognizing the underlying aspects of power underneath that and the ways in which people can agree with you from a hearts and minds space, but if the incentive structures of profit or growth or of power or something else are standing in the way of real change, the kind of hearts and minds will oftentimes not win out. This is the whole idea of charitable solutions to structural problems, right? Because we will then end up with a lot of charity rather than having to undo systems, because undoing systems means that there is sort of changes that creates a new environment. And people will stand in the way of that while sort of heralding the work to help or show love and compassion. It's not love and compassion that we need if it's not in service of an active justice.
Thanks for that, Rashad. There's lots of questions in the chat. If this will be recorded, it is being recorded, and we will send.
Man, you got my whole flub with the slides at the end. I wasn't on. This is my first day back from vacation, everyone. So
yeah, we're getting him right off of vacation. Well, yes, yes, it is being recorded. We'll be sending a link around after this if you want to share it or be able to access this information later. Our next question is, how do we tell the story of the ERA amendment and the structural, that it's changing the structural basis of racism as it intersects with the Black community and change?
It's a question I feel like I'd have to dig in a little bit more on, but my first sort of my first reaction is like, when I think all these stories, is that we have to tell stories of not just unfortunate, but unjust. And so we actually have to show concrete harm. We have to show the sort of impacts of not having sort of equal rights and sort of show the harms that are caused. Because you actually have to sort of identify the problem, then you have to build sort of the right level of stories to rally people around the solutions, and then you have to motivate people to be able to act. And each of those three things requires a different sort of level of sophistication. Also, really important for the funders, requires a level of infrastructure. You can't get to a place where you can rally people around a story if you don't have the infrastructure to reach people. You can have the best video on the ERA and no one sees it, and our opponents could have the worst video and millions of people see it, and we will probably not be in a place where we motivate people to act. And so part of the stories that we tell people is not just stories that get people to feel, but get stories that get people to act, that help for people focus on the barriers in the way. And then there's also all sorts of political, political pieces connected to that. So really recognizing sort of who we have to target, Who do we have to move? And some of that gets in from like big narrative work into sort of more clear messaging work, which is once again still about messaging. And sort of in the paper, I talked a bit about in the beginning the interplay between short-term and long-term victories, the sort of playoff sometimes that we have to make in terms of winning something in the short term and the long-term seismic shifts. Oftentimes, I think we tell ourselves a story that we're making those trade-offs when we tell the wrong story. I think we actually are making those trade-offs a lot less than we would like to believe. But sometimes we do have to make those trade-offs as well in terms of what we prioritize and what we don't.
Great. The next question is, can you talk a little bit more about the importance of celebrating the positive and inspiring stories of Black people and Black communities?
Yeah, I mean, this is so incredibly important. And I don't say that we should only tell stories that are like, quote unquote, like, respectable politics, where they're all great. One of my favorite movies is Ryan Coogler's Fruitvale Station and the story of Oscar Grant. And it tells a story of systems. It tells a story of someone that's trying to get their life together, someone that's like managing and navigating a lot of different things. And we need stories that are complex, but we need stories where Black people are the protagonists. And when I talked about Black people being the protagonists in the American story of voting, when I talked about Black people being the protagonists in the American story of education and so many other things, particularly of activism and democracy, of seeing movements around the world use our songs and our chants and our rallying cries as frameworks for their own fights for liberation, right? How we tell those stories and not telling the constant stories of deficit, the constant stories of disparity, the constant stories of a community that is vulnerable, but a community that, like any other community that would face such a powerful system like systemic racism, they too would be in a similar situation. And so, like, to the extent that it's important that we tell those stories is that we need to tell stories of Black joy, which is not the absence of pain, but the presence of aspiration, not just what we are fighting against, but what we are fighting for. We need to tell stories of Black brilliance. I mean, I think about just in this moment of COVID, all the ways in which Black people have been the center of helping people get through, at the heart of so many of the sort of essential workers in communities around the country, at the heart of creating some of the most brilliant and creative spaces online and on social media, on IG Live, where people were coming together around music and health and food and so much more. If we can lean into the sort of potential, if we lead into the contributions, what that makes us sort of center is that we actually then have to fight against the barriers that would take that away from us. Why wouldn't we as a country want to unlock more of that? Why would we want to stand in the way of that? That there must be a different project at play for anyone that would want to prevent more of that brilliance from being unlocked. And so part of why we have to tell those stories is because those stories allow us to act in ways that isn't simply about help and charity, but about justice and structural change. And justice and structural change gets us to a place where we need less help and charity.
Thanks, Rashad. The next question I'm going to read word for word because it's got a bit of a comment in it. So from Shannon Ritchie, she says that I've been taught that storytelling alongside directly impacted individuals who have been harmed by systems is necessary for people to act because they feel the efficacy. For example, I can help one person, but I can't help everyone. With narratives and messaging work, the question is, do you see that changing now? Do we need to focus on systems and structures only in this moment?
So, no. And I'm glad this question is because I want to really like lead into this. So the point that I'm really making is that I'm not against storytelling at all. Like, I feel like you've spent enough time with me, I'll tell you a lot of stories. What I am focused on is that we have to tell the right stories. And oftentimes we tell stories that are trying to simply build empathy, because we have gotten to this idea that empathy will unlock the type of structural change. If people were just more empathetic of Black people or poor people or other sort of oppressed people, then things would change. And empathy gets us charity over structural change. And so that is why, for me, it's very important that we are focusing right on telling stories that are not about empathy, but about power. Because, even if we think about the sort of moments of big cultural change over the last several years, right? Over the last 5, 6, 7 decades, right? And we look at the SNCC organizers at the lunch counters. That wasn't a story of empathy. That was a story of power, of young people taking brave steps and getting people behind them. If we look at the stories of undocumented youth coming out as undocumented and demanding the ability to be fully counted as part of the country that is theirs, those are stories of power. Those are stories of people you want to get behind. If we look at the stories of loving and committed couples who couldn't see their partner in the hospital, those were not stories of empathy. If it was just empathy, people would have stopped at civil unions because they would have been able to solve the problem of folks not being able to see their partner. But the only marriage equality worked because that is a story of seeing someone as fully equal, seeing someone as fully human. Some of what we do through the social service language that we have in our movement is that we do this almost kind of fetishizing of real people stories, of impacted communities. And we put impacted communities out there to sort of tell the stories to make us all feel sad. Like we want to do something to help that person, but that help oftentimes doesn't lead to structural change. That help, in fact, over the last several decades, if you look across all the numbers, has continued to make it so that even while we have more nonprofits doing that work, we have greater income inequality. We have greater gaps in home ownership. We have greater gaps in all sorts of things. We have corporations making more and more and people making less and less, and corporations having to do less and less to make more and more, while all of us have to do more and more, gig economy, all of these other things, to make less and less. And so part of what I think is important here is that it's not that we don't want to center the stories of folks who are impacted. It's that we don't use people's stories to elicit empathy. We center the stories of people fighting for change to build power. And power has the ability to change the rules. The final thing I'll just say about that is I think about it living in New York City, right? And, it's died down a little bit. But at 7 o'clock, people go out on their balconies, out into out of their windows, onto the streets, into the parks, and cheer for essential workers that in many ways were invisible to people before, workers who many people would not pick up a petition for or center in sort of what they did on election day. And part of this is that we can't mistake presence and visibility for power. And this is also what we get into with storytelling, is that we think presence and visibility, the retweets, the awareness is enough on its own. And just like a Black president doesn't mean that we are post-racial, just like a Black pop star announcing that she's pregnant and the internet stopping doesn't mean that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture. In fact, America can love Black culture, monetize and celebrate it, and hate Black people at the same time. And so the storytelling that we do has to lead towards power. And I really want that to be an important piece that people take away from this. I am not saying don't tell stories. I am saying that we have to tell stories that lead us from what sometimes people think of as inequality being unfortunate, like a car accident, but leads people to recognizing that inequality is unjust. That we have to have systems-based stories that put the energy not on Black people being less likely to get a loan from the bank, but banks excluding Black people from loans.
Okay, I'm going to ask just the last question here, which seems sort of related. How do you navigate telling stories of power while being wary of perpetuating bootstraps ideologies?
Well, I mean, that's the whole reason why I'm telling stories of power. Empathy and charity is about bootstraps. It's about like, I went to this program and I learned and I overcame all of these like problems and I'm better off. And look, America's always going to be full of those stories, and hopefully we can be full of more of them because we undo the barriers. There is a story that every one of us probably has in this call of moments where hard work, focus, opened up new doors. That doesn't mean that we should accept the idea that there are that some people have doors and some people have cement walls. That some people have open terrain full of opportunity, and some people don't even have the opportunity to see sort of 3 steps in front of them because of everything that's coming at them. And so we absolutely cannot be in a story of bootstraps ideology. And sort of I hope that people will lean into the paper because I fundamentally believe that what we are doing is a bootstraps narratives in our movement far too often. And that when we tell stories of unfortunate conversations, unfortunate situations, when we put the sort of passive voice on the system and the active voice on the people. And so all of this, right, all of this work around narrative work, all of this work around moving from unfortunate to unjust is about recognizing the power and the role that systems have and the role that individuals and institutions have in perpetuating and holding them up because of the incentive structures that are before them. And part of the work that we have to do is we sort of can potentially feel the wind changing. If we see more and more people asking what they can do about racial justice, is that we have to take this moment to undo the systems and the structures that have hurt people and the systems and structures that stand in the way of progress. And we can't accept anything less than that because anything less than that will get us sort of some short-term successes, but racism will shapeshift. It will evolve. It will turn back. The poll taxes become voter ID laws. Mass incarceration is just an extension of Jim Crow. Systems shapeshift unless we build power and we change the systemic structures that have hurt and harmed people. And so what is really important in storytelling and what is really important in narrative change is having a clear understanding of power. And power is the ability to change the rules. Sometimes they are the written rules of policy, and other times they are the unwritten rules of culture. But our ability to change the rules will open up more opportunity for us to change society, to change what is acceptable, which is the floor, and change what is possible, which is the ceiling, and open up a whole new opportunities for us to win in a new dynamic, a new narrative terrain that we have tilled, and leverage new stories to create new experiences for our people.
Great. Well, I think we will leave it at that and give people a few minutes to transition. Anything last that you wanted to say, Rashad?
Thank you all for joining us. I look forward to continue to be in a conversation. So many people joined, 100 folks joined to hear me talk a little bit about narrative today. But as you all, if anyone has talked to me a lot, knows that I talk about this stuff a lot. I think about it a lot. I try to figure out this. We have a version 2 of the paper that I've been working on, and that will sort of dig into some other aspects very soon. some pieces that we quite didn't make it into this first paper. And so look forward to that in the next coming weeks, as well as pieces that we continue to push mainstream media and other places on how do we get this story right. And getting this story right and building power around the right story is going to be so critical to winning. And I guess if there's anything that I want to lead people to, is that this is about winning. It's about doing the things necessary to win, and to win justice and freedom. And so I hope to continue to be in this work and this conversation with you, and continue for us at Color Change to share our learnings and our thinkings and the work as we work to win.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We will see you in the emails and the work meetings.
Thanks.
Take care.